Okay, so good evening, everybody, and welcome to Last Mountain Bird Observatory's first ever virtual bird banding workshop. So my name is Jordan, and I'll be your presenter this evening. I'm the current bander in charge out at LMBO, and I will actually be celebrating 10 years in August since I first started volunteering at the station. Just some quick housekeeping. I think most of us have probably been in virtual presentations before, so this won't be a surprise, but we'll ask you to stay muted during the presentation. We do have like a little bit of tech support too if you're having trouble figuring that out. Tonight's presentation will also be recorded, so just keep that in mind if you want to keep your camera off and you don't want your face in our videos, because it will be uploaded to YouTube after. I also just wanted to say, like, sometimes tonight I might be getting into a lot of jargon, or if it's ever feeling like the information is overwhelming, don't worry. This video will be up on YouTube, on Nature Saskatchewan's YouTube. And I've also created a Google Drive with some supplemental banding material as well, if anything seems terribly confusing. But without further ado, let's jump right into it. So just a quick little overview of what we're going to cover tonight. It's going to be about an hour. And I'd like to talk about how Last Mountain Bird Observatory, how we got started and how we've contributed to the conservation of songbirds. Then I'll talk a little bit on how you can volunteer at the station and what you get to do as a volunteer. And then we're going to kind of change gears and we're going to get into some information heavy, talk about how you would learn how to band, and we'll really dive into how we age and sex songbirds or passerines and how to use the guide we use called Pule, and I'll talk a little bit about that later. Okay, so LMBO was established in 1990. Our founder, Al Smith, this is him right here, was banding around the Last Mountain Lake National Wildlife Area in '89, trying to find a good site to set up a migratory monitoring station. And he really wanted to target boreal breeding birds, particularly warblers, just because traditional methods like breeding bird surveys don't cover the northern boreal as well as you can imagine. It's not quite as accessible. So we can wait for the birds to come down here to us on their migration instead. And so Al had set up the station in the regional park, and he had found that it was actually quite productive. And so he did a full season in 1990. We became part of the Canadian Migratory Monitoring Network. And this is a Canada-wide effort to monitor songbirds. And so when we say migratory, we mean that all these stations are operating while the birds are migrating. And so each station will have a spring season. They'll close for breeding season, which is like June and July, and then they open back up in the fall for fall migration. And so Al started the station as a biologist working with the Canadian Wildlife Service. And when he retired, Nature Saskatchewan took up the running of the station. And Al is still involved in the station. He runs all our banding permits and the data management. I run the kind of the field operations and occasionally get to do cool things like this workshop as well. And this just shows kind of a map of the area. Sometimes people get us confused with the Migratory Bird Sanctuary or with the National Wildlife Area. So Last Mountain Bird Observatory, the banding station, is totally separate from the sanctuary and the wildlife area. I've gotten a number of emails from time to time about people who want like tours of the sanctuary or the wildlife area, and we don't do that. I can only kind of direct you to some good areas where you can check out some birds. So to actually become a volunteer at LMBO is really easy. You just need to email us, and we ask that you're over the age of 16. But we also have bent this rule in the past for youth who are super keen. We don't really have huge numbers of people who want to volunteer because of our more isolated location. So we don't have any membership requirements or tests or applications you have to fill out. We just ask that you email us. Like we did used to accept drop-in volunteers in the past, but because of COVID, we are asking volunteers and visitors to register before coming. So some of the potential jobs you may get to do as a volunteer: you can act as a scribe, an extractor, a bander, a birder, or you can help with public interpretation or education. And I'll go into a little bit more detail on each of these. So if you have no banding experience and you want to learn, or you don't want to touch birds, you would probably enjoy being a scribe. So that just means that you're going to be writing down the data as the bander calls it out. It doesn't require any experience, only that you know how to write letters and numbers. And this is really good if you want to learn bird banding, because you'll be sitting right next to the bander. You'll get to see everything that the bander is doing, and they'll kind of explain what they're doing as they do it. We also typically let scribes handle already banded birds outside of the station so that they can start to develop the dexterity and the skill that's needed for some of the other jobs. So that brings us to extracting. So I'm kind of assuming you guys are a little familiar with our station already, or banding stations. We use these mist nets to capture songbirds. They kind of go in between these rows of trees and the birds because they can't see them fly into them. And so extractors' jobs is to get the birds out of the net. And a lot of the time, it's not as easy as it looks. It does require confidence in holding birds and a little bit of dexterity. When I'm teaching people to extract, I typically describe each bird as a new puzzle, because you have to figure out the way it went in the net and how it looped its wings or how it got the net here. And some birds just have a knack for really tangling themselves in this net. The next thing you could kind of help with, maybe you're not interested in banding or handling, or maybe you just kind of want to hang out with a few bird nerds for the day and contribute to the project. You can do this by helping us conduct the daily census, which is a route we walk every day at 9 o'clock, just to get an idea of what birds are in the area, but that we might be missing from around the nets. You can also help collect incidental observations. Those are birds that are around the nets, but maybe not hitting them. And we generally prefer people who do census have some confidence with their bird identification. But again, like a lot of this stuff, it's all kind of training on the job, and we can teach you a lot of this in the field. Another thing that you can help out with is public education. So this is another really important part of banding, because it lets the public see birds up close and to ask questions about migration and conservation of songbirds. And people are generally interested in birds, the banding process, migration and conservation. And so you can help the banders out just by answering these questions so that the banders or the extractors can kind of focus more so on what they're doing. And this is actually a huge help to us, especially if we're having like a super busy day at the station. The birds always come first, because you have to remember these birds weigh about the same as a loony, and this is a stressful experience for them. So we're trying to process them as quickly as possible. So even if there's someone there who can kind of help us out with visitors, it's a big help. And the next thing, and the thing that people are generally most excited about, is banding. So you can see, like from this picture here, we're really lucky we have an indoor banding office. And it's awesome because it kind of gets us out of the elements, but it also means that we want people to have a little bit more confidence in handling birds before we let them handle them inside, because birds have escaped in the office and it's really stressful for them. And so the other thing I kind of want to point out is, like, when you see us banding there and we make it look easy, you have to remember banding requires time and effort to really develop the skill. And we want to help you learn it as well. But just don't think you're going to jump in and be amazing at it right away. So this is just a picture of our banding table. And so banding includes the identification of the bird, taking mass, determining age and sex of the bird, taking wing length, fat score. You're looking for any breeding characteristics, plus any other measurements that might be required. And this can vary on species. Again, I don't want to spend like a whole lot of time on this because this is something that's really easy to kind of show and teach, like when you're at the station. And so this is kind of like a little nudge for you to just go visit the station. And so when we're teaching you how to band, we have to make sure you're familiar with a few things before we put you into the chair. We want you familiar with the birds that we're likely to catch at LMBO, the parts of the bird, including names of their feathers, what molt is, and how we use it to age birds, and also how to use Pule's guide. So if this seems like a lot, don't panic yet. I'm going to be talking about each of these in more detail. I just want to impress upon you that, like, when you see us banding, we can make it look easy, but it is a science and it is a skill, and we do really want to help you develop it as well. So just a little bit about bird ID. So for a lot of the volunteer jobs you kind of discussed, we ask that you have some bird identification skills. And this doesn't mean that you have to be familiar with every bird ever captured at LMBO, but even having like a little bit of knowledge, maybe a little bit more than the infographic here, but that would still be helpful. So in the next few slides, I'm going to show you a few of the species that we catch. It's going to be mostly sparrows and warblers. And yeah, let's get into this. This will be the most aesthetically pleasing part of the presentation. So the first ones we have here, this is a Harris sparrow on the left with that beautiful black bib, and beside it a white-crowned sparrow. These are both ground-dwelling sparrows. They have chunkier bodies and orange bills, but the thing that gives the Harris sparrow away is that black bib. Even when even younger Harris sparrows will have some of that black scalloping in the face, and they're also bigger than a white-crowned sparrow. So if you ever see a flock of sparrows, usually these guys will be coming through right away this spring, and they come later in the fall. You'll see a mixed flock of white throats, white crowns, and maybe a few Harris kind of mixed in. The Harris will look much rounder than the ones surrounding it. This next one is a white-throated sparrow, and both of these are white-throated sparrows. White-throated sparrows can be a little bit tricky because they have two different morphs, a white morph on the left and a tan morph on the right. And you actually determine which morph it is based on the median crown stripe. That just means the middle stripe down the middle of the top of their head. So in white morph, it's going to be white. In tan morph, it's going to be tan. And there's actually a lot of variation between the morphs and within the morphs. So you can have a dull white morph to bright white morph and dull to bright tan morphs as well. Here we have a fox sparrow and a dark-eyed junco. this species is actually moving through Regina. These species are moving through Regina right now. Fox sparrows, I think they're fairly easy to identify. They're a very large, chunky sparrow, and we get the red morph here, so they're typically pretty easy to spot in the brush. The next one, this dark-eyed junco on the right, they're relatively easy to identify as well. We typically get the slate-colored juncos, so that just means they kind of have a dark slate back, kind of anywhere from like blackish to grayish. And when they fly, you can actually see these outer white tail feathers. And there's been a ton of these guys in my yard lately. These next guys, so on the left is a swamp sparrow, and on the right is a Lincoln sparrow. So looking at them side by side, you would think you wouldn't mix them up, but you can. And this is because they're both smaller sparrows. They're both kind of grayish with a flat head. The biggest thing that kind of helps is the rufous wing, so kind of this reddish wing color on the swamp sparrow. The Lincoln sparrow looks kind of just plain and drab and gray in comparison. This next one is an American tree sparrow. It gets its own slide because they are my favorite sparrow. These guys are very small sparrows with a round little head, that bicolored bill, and the chestnut on their head kind of helps to identify them. And this is another kind of early spring migrant that has already been seen in Regina quite a few times. These next guys, so the one on the right is a Downy woodpecker, and the one on the, oh sorry, I've mixed that up. The one on the left is a Downy woodpecker, and the one on the right is a hairy woodpecker. And so these guys are both black and white woodpeckers, and it's they can be difficult to tell apart, but the easiest way is looking at their bill size. So the Downy, their bill is less than the width of their head, and the hairy, it's as long as the width of their head. Oh, let's just go back. You can also see, like in my hand, there's a very obvious size difference. The Downy I can kind of comfortably hold, and the hairy is closer to like the size of a robin. So these next guys are called kinglets. On the left, we have a golden crowned kinglet, and on the right, we have ruby crowned. And these guys very commonly get mixed up with other small songbirds like warblers or vireos. And a good feature to kind of watch out is like their eye looks really big on their head, and their bill also looks a little bit finer. Like when you see these guys out in the field, they're very busy and very fast. Very similar behavior to something like a warbler. Okay, these are just kind of a couple cool ones I kind of threw in here, a little bit unusual. So the one on the left is a loggerhead shrike that we caught at the station this past spring. They are a species at risk here in Saskatchewan. It was really exciting to see it. And then the one on the right is a brown creeper. They're kind of a species that's a little bit harder to find. They tend to cling to trees and they camouflage in very well, but they're very easy to identify if you do see them because of the shape of their bill. So these guys, they're both yellow-rumped warblers, specifically Myrtle Warblers. That's the subspecies of yellow-rumped warbler that we typically see here. The one on the left is a spring Myrtle Warbler, and the one on the right is a fall Myrtle Warbler. So they do change quite a bit between seasons. The other difference is the one on the left is a male and the one on the right is a female. Okay, so this is a very common misidentification that happens. It's between a Tennessee warbler and an orange-crowned warbler. So they're both about the same size, they have the same kind of body shape, and they have very similar behaviors. The biggest thing that will help you determine whether it's a Tennessee versus an orange-crowned, so the Tennessee, excuse me, on the left, they, like in the spring, they have a gray head and then this very greenish body. They also tend to be more white underneath. Whereas the orange crown, they tend to be more of this like more subdued olive green color, and they're heavily washed yellow. Another big thing that will help is this eye line here. So it doesn't matter what plumage, whether it's spring or fall, the Tennessee is in, they always have this very distinct eye line, whereas the orange crown does not. Here we have some very common warblers you guys might already be familiar with. A yellow warbler on the left. This is a very gorgeous spring male, that bright yellow and then the chestnut stripes down the side. And on the right is a common yellowthroat. They tend to hang around like marshes, those kind of areas. You might have heard them and not known what they are. They go witchity, witchity, witchity. So the next guys we have is an ovenbird and a Cape May warbler. So the ovenbird is a type of warbler. They're very commonly mistaken for thrushes because it looks very much like a thrush. It's brown up top. It has like that streaky necklace across the breast. And they actually have similar behaviors to thrushes as well. They hang out on the ground. They kind of kick up the underbrush and pick insects and stuff off the ground like that. And I included the Cape May warbler because it tends to get mixed in with those dull warblers, dull fall warblers as well. And the easiest way to kind of tell these guys apart from other fall warblers is the streakiness of their breast here. They've been given the nickname Little Tigers because they're striped like this. This next one was kind of cool. So this is a Wilson's warbler. They can look quite similar to yellow warblers because they're small and they're just kind of yellow all over. The biggest identification help for these guys is their black cap on top of their head. But it's generally very present and obvious in males, but it's less defined in females. Especially hatchier females sometimes don't have any black feathers on top of their head. And the biggest help for these guys from distinguishing a small female like this with no black, you still kind of see the outline of the cap, whereas a yellow warbler will just look yellow all over and there won't be any markings on their face or head. Okay, so we're kind of getting into the parts of the bird and the various feathers and tracks that you'll need to know as a bander. I just wanted to pause here for a moment before I go to the pictures. You do not have to memorize these right away. We understand people need time to learn. I don't expect you to know everything immediately. So this is an illustration from Pule's guide showing the parts of the bird. It has like some basic ones you might be familiar with already, like back and rump, but the ones that we're going to be focusing on and the ones that we typically use to age birds are the flight feathers. So those are the feathers in the wing and the tail. So I just want you to take a look at this picture and see the primary flight feathers kind of over here, the secondary flight feathers in here, and particularly the primary coverts, which cover the primary flight feathers, and the greater coverts here that cover the secondary. And the other thing down here is the tail feathers. They're called rectrices or rex. And you'll also notice that some of these are numbered. This is like the order birds will lose and grow them, and I'll kind of talk about it a little bit later. This next picture is just like a more detailed illustration of the head. I just included it because like when you get into difficult identifications, particularly in sparrows, the spatial pattern is important, but for tonight we don't have to worry about it. I just kind of included it for interest's sake. And before we kind of really dive deep into molt and how we age and sex birds, I just want to make sure that we are on the same page on what a molt and what a molt limit is. So you can spell molt either way, but it's in reference to, it just means that birds lose old feathers to replace new ones as part of their regular life cycle. So for songbirds, this usually means that they are replacing feathers once or twice a year, depending on the species. And you might have seen birds like this poor grackle in your yard who look kind of scraggly. This guy is an active molt. You can see he's got some brown feathers that are old that need to be replaced and some shiny black ones coming in. And so a molt limit is basically just the difference between a new and an old feather. And you can clearly see on this robin that there's a mix of old and new feathers. So for example, in here you could say there's a molt limit within the primary coverts because there's new feathers here and old feathers there. And depending on where the molt limit occurs in the bird, this is what helps you age the bird. And this is because birds in their first year of life will molt and have different molt limits than adult birds. And that's a very oversimplified statement, but it is generally true for songbirds, and we'll kind of explore that a little bit more. And so I've talked about Pule a little bit before, but molt limits and molt patterns differ greatly between different groups of birds. So we use this book by Peter Pule. It gives highly detailed information on every species in North America, where to expect molt limits, and how helpful particular markers are. And Pule actually uses specific words to indicate how often certain characteristics occur in populations. And I'll explain that a little bit later too. And so we talked about how molt is part of the bird's cycle. So this cycle can happen once or twice a year. And so for birds that have breeding and non-breeding plumage, they're going to go through molt twice in 1 year. And so birds will go through a pre-basic molt, and that will lead them to a non-breeding or basic plumage. And then in the spring, they go through a pre-alternate molt, leading to their breeding or alternate plumage. Versus birds who just go through a single molt and just have a single plumage. They look the same all year round. They only go through one molt called the pre-basic. And I will be defining these kind of in the next few slides as well, just to kind of not to throw too much terminology at you at once. And so you can break down basic and alternate strategies into simple and complex. For tonight, we're going to be focusing on the simple strategies. So what you see like the sharp-shinned hawk has, or the herring gull. Complex molts just mean that there might be a few extra in between from when it gets from breeding to non-breeding, so on and so forth. But for tonight, we're just going to focus on the simple strategies. And so these molts can be described as either complete or partial. A complete molt means that all feathers are replaced, so there would be no molt limits. A partial molt means that some feathers are replaced, but others are retained, so you're going to have a mix of old and new feathers, so there will be molt limits. Generally speaking, adults will go through complete pre-basic molts, while juveniles go through partial pre-basic molts. Just to kind of illustrate this a little bit better, here is an example of basic molt. So let's say a robin is born. It's born into that natal down, that fluffy stuff we associate baby birds with. It would molt into its juvenile plumage. And then it would undergo its first pre-basic molt, resulting in its first basic plumage. And some of those feathers are retained. So what this diagram is kind of showing is these gray retained feathers are retained juvenile feathers, while the yellow are the feathers from their first pre-basic molt. And you'll kind of notice a lot, I'm going to say pre-basic molt leading to basic plumage. That's kind of the nomenclature that molt follows. But yeah, and then you get your first basic plumage, and then a year after that, so the robin completes its first migration to the winter, and then it comes back up to the summer grounds. It will undergo a definitive pre-basic molt after breeding, resulting in definitive basic plumage. You can also think of definitive as adult. So you can think of the first pre-basic, it was a partial molt, there was feathers retained. The definitive pre-basic results in adult plumage, so no molt limits there. And basically, for the rest of the robin's life, it will only go through definitive pre-basic molts from this point on. This is in the alternate molt example. So if birds have a breeding and a non-breeding plumage, it gets a little bit more complicated. You can see there's a few more steps. You would start off in your juvenile plumage. You go through your first basic molt, resulting in your first basic plumage. And then for the bird's first breeding season, its first summer, it goes through its first alternate. And some of the feathers from the first basic are retained. And you can kind of see that here on the gull. And then after its first alternate plumage, it will go into definitive pre-basic and definitive pre-alternate, and it will just become like an adult molt. And basically the timeline for this guy, the basic plumage, the pre-basic molts occur on the summer ground after breeding, and the pre-alternate molts occur on the winter grounds before breeding. So with alternate molts, it does create more molt limits in the wings. So it kind of makes things a little bit muddier, makes it a little bit more difficult. So you're just going to be seeing multiple feather ages. It's not just going to be old and new, like in birds who only have basic molts. So to illustrate this, I'm going to kind of take you through in detail this example with an indigo bunting. This is not a common capture at the station. It just happened to be what this infographic had, and they actually have very easy molt limits because they go from bright blue to brown, so they're very easy to see. The one thing you're going to notice in this diagram is there's a ton of different terms that they use to describe molt. We're going to focus on juvenile, excuse me, we're going to focus on juvenile, first pre-basic, first pre-alternate, definitive pre-basic, and definitive pre-alternate. Okay. So to start this off, on the left, you see is the indigo bunting as a juvenile. So this is a bird that's fairly fresh out of the nest. It actually still has that fleshy gape in its mouth. So here is a comparison between the juvenile plumage and the first basic plumage. You can see that there's a few blue feathers kind of starting to poke through on the bird. On the right, you'll see there's a few blue feathers kind of poking through on the body and on the shoulders, kind of on these coverts kind of higher up. There isn't a lot of change in the wing here, so I didn't show it. The next few slides, though, will focus very heavily on the flight feathers. So this is first basic to first pre-alternate. So this bird is still kind of in its first cycle, and it's going from non-breeding plumage to its first breeding plumage. And just to make a note on this guy, so birds do have a fair amount of individual variation. And you can kind of see there's a big difference between the greater coverts from the bird on the left and the bird on the right. And so I just on the bird on the right, you'll see actually 3 different generations of feathers. So the primary coverts here are retained juvenile feathers. So this is from its very first molt. These kind of less bright blue ones will be retained from its first pre-basic. So that's kind of, this guy is in the same cycle, but you can see there's a very big difference between these guys. Buntings also kind of complicate things by having what's called a suspended molt, which means they'll start molting before they migrate. They start molting, then they stop, they migrate, and they'll finish their molt on the wintering grounds. So that could be what's happening here. But you can also see in this guy on the right, these bright blue brand new feathers. So this would be from its first pre-alternate, these bright breeding feathers right here. So continuing from that, so this guy is now going from first alternate to definitive basic. So it's going from its first breeding plumage to its adult non-breeding plumage. And you can see, so what makes this easy now is the adult definitive is complete. So he will have replaced all of the feathers in his wing. There's no molt limits here. All these feathers have been replaced. Everything is bright and shiny and brand new. And you can see it's non-breeding because you can see everything is a little bit browner. It's not quite as bright as you would expect in like a breeding bird. And so from there, it's going from definitive basic to definitive alternate. And that's just, now it's non-breeding to breeding. And again, and so alternate molts are usually partial. So you will see a little bit of a molt limit, but it's going to be between the coverts and not within. So you can see on the left, the guy, everything is fresh, everything is about the same age. The guy on the right, you'll see the greater coverts here. They're very new. You also see a couple replaced secondaries in here. And then the primary coverts and the rest of the flight feathers are retained. And this is because this is what's coverts kind of act as body feathers and flight feathers. That's why sometimes, that's why they're replaced in breeding plumage, but not all these flight feathers. It's just kind of a way to save a little bit of energy instead of going through 2 complete molts in 1 year, because feathers are quite expensive to make, and it kind of it's a little bit harder for birds to operate if they're missing a few feathers. And I just wanted to bring up this picture of a robin again, because this is what active molt looks like. You can actively see that bird, that the feathers are being replaced. And you might remember from that diagram earlier on, the primaries were numbered 1 through 9 this way. Well, whereas the secondaries were numbered the opposite way. And so usually that's kind of the order that birds will replace their feathers in. So the primaries are replaced inside to out, whereas the secondaries, excluding a few of the ones on the closer to the body, are replaced the opposite way. And just to give you an idea of what we're usually looking at, because a lot of times molt limits are not super obvious. This is a comparison of a robin, one of which is in its first basic plumage, and the other in its definitive basic plumage. And so it's not super obvious which is which right away. The robin on the left is the adult bird. And looking between these two, what I want you to see is there isn't any obvious molt limits. And the feathers, like specifically, like look at these edges, like these edges on the secondaries versus the edges on the secondaries on this bird. Usually younger birds have to grow out their feathers really quickly, and they don't have the same skills that an older bird has. Like they're not as good as foraging yet. So their feathers tend to be of a lower quality. And like microscopically, like feathers kind of knit together. That's why they're airtight and they're good for flight. So you can see they don't knit together quite as nicely along these edges. And the other thing is the amount of edging on the primary coverts. So you can see on the adult, it's really clear, whereas on the juvenile bird, it's a little bit less distinct. But like I said, this is kind of harder to see, which is why I kind of bring it up. Banders usually kind of have to build up a mental catalog, and that's what really helps you determine this is this versus this. And so you would think we've talked a lot about all these molt codes, and you would think that we would use codes that line up with these birds' molt cycles, but we don't. We use calendar years instead. So there are systems of aging birds that use molt codes, but they are newer systems and we haven't adopted them yet. So these are the codes that we use instead. Unknown is obviously, we don't know. This usually happens in species like house sparrow. They go through a complete molt no matter how old they are. So if they're not in a juvenile plumage, we don't know how old they are. A hatch year bird means that it was in its first calendar year. They're usually in first basic plumage. And after that, it becomes after hatch year, which is at least its second calendar year. We use hatch year and after hatch year after breeding. Usually because because birds go through that complete molt every year, we can't get any more specific than at least second year. And we use hatch year after breeding because they would have hatched that year. And then in the spring, we do second year and after second year. That's because, like, obviously birds have not hatched yet. They can't be a hatch year. We can still use after hatch year, but it's less specific. So we try to use second year or after second year as much as possible. And these codes do continue up until third year or after third year, but they typically apply to species who have a lot more complicated molts, like woodpeckers or owls, and we're not gonna worry about those today. So kind of moving back onto Pule. So this book is going to contain all of the information that you need to age and sex birds. The group and species accounts are highly detailed, and they include descriptions of what molts birds go through, when they go through them, and where to look for molt limits in birds. So the most important parts of Pule are the introductions. So the first 17 pages, the group account, which kind of details expected molt patterns for groups of birds. So for example, you could look up warblers and kind of see what you can generally expect. And then it's broken down further into individual species accounts, which detail all the information that you need to identify age and sex. So the introduction, so the first 17 pages, it contains a lot of information. It includes, like, the parts of birds that I showed you that diagram from. It goes through kind of beginner ID, age, and sexing techniques. It goes through all the measurements you typically have to take as a bander. It talks a little bit about wing morphology and sculling. Sculling is another aging tool we can use, because kind of like human babies, like where our skulls aren't fully fused yet, birds have that same thing. And because their skin is translucent, we can actually see the windows in the skull. So you just kind of blow on the bird's head and kind of move the skin around, and you look for the fully pneumaticized, fully fused skull. And that will be like pink and chalky white versus the non-pneumaticized skull, which is like kind of like reddish purple. He also goes through like the basics of molt and plumage terminology. So all the words that we use tonight, the pre-basic molt, the pre-supplemental molt, we didn't really talk about that too much. It's just an extra molt that some birds go through in between the first pre-basic and the first pre-alternate. And then he also includes continued words of caution and encouragement. And that is very fitting, quite frankly. If you have ever tried to read Pule, and I say try because Pule is very dense to read. So if you do decide to read it and you're finding it really difficult, that's because it is. It's basically written very similar to a scientific paper. It's supposed to contain a lot of information in the least amount of words as possible. So I personally find reading Pule plus other materials and then going back and reviewing Pule tends to make a little bit more sense. And so I have made a Google Drive, which I will share the link to, and it has like a few supplemental readings, and it also has a presentation that was made by Peter Pule on how to age and sex boreal warblers. The introduction actually continues into 18 to 28, and this kind of gets into some more banding techniques. Like it talks about aging and sexing juveniles, feather shape and wear, kind of like what I was talking about, like how the feathers don't knit together quite as well, and it has a few more diagrams on what that looks like. It talks about growth bars. So when birds are growing their feathers out, if they have a few days where they don't get as much food, they'll actually have lines through their feathers. And it will literally look like there's just no feathers like in like perfect lines. And birds will only get growth bars that go all the way through in their first year typically, because they're growing all of their feathers out at once versus sequentially like an adult bird. He also goes into detail about breeding characteristics like cloacal protuberance, which is a swelling of the cloaca on males during the breeding season. It talks about brood patches, which is a patch on usually females. They will pluck the feathers off of their belly, and the tissue becomes highly vascularized, and it becomes basically this perfect little heating pad for eggs. Then he talks about other techniques like drawing blood and stuff like that. If you're doing that, we don't usually do that. A section I really like in this introduction is the suggested approach to aging and sexing, because he kind of takes you through a mental map of how to use the species accounts and how it kind of helps. And then he also talks a little bit about hybrids and geographic variation, and that's important for species that are really widespread, like something like a song sparrow, for example, which exists here in the more eastern parts of Canada. I just mean like east of the Rockies and west of the Rockies. There's a lot of geographic variation and therefore more subspecies. And then he actually has a section where he describes how to use the guide. And this is actually very helpful, especially if you're trying to use Pule totally unguided, you're trying to figure it out yourself. The first thing he talks about is standardized colors. So when Pule describes colors, he's using very specific colors, like when he says rufous versus chestnut, when he says buffy versus beige, he's effectively standardized them. So when you're learning Pule, you have to learn his standardized form of colors, essentially. And then he kind of goes through how he has formatted each species account. Each account contains a heading with common English names, scientific names, the alpha code for the species, that's the 4-letter alpha code that lots of birders use, also a species number, as well as recommended band sizes. Then he kind of goes into identification notes for that species and where they overlap with similar species and how to tell them apart. He then goes into geographic variation and subspecies. He goes into the molt specifically, like what birds replace during their pre-alternate versus their pre-basic, and where you can expect to see those molt limits. He includes skull dates, so when you can skull birds to determine their age. And then he goes into the very specific age and sex criteria that you can use. He'll also list any hybrids that have been reported. And the important thing that he uses is these bar graphs. And lots of people have a problem reading them. I'll explain them in a little bit. So this was what I was kind of talking about, is his modifiers. He specifically uses them to indicate proportions of the population which display certain molt conditions. We complain a lot about how Pule sounds slippery because he says usually and often. Those, you see those a lot, but they correspond to probabilities, how often you're going to see this in a particular bird. So if, say, it rarely replaces its tail feathers, you can look there, you probably won't see it. Whereas if it usually replaces its tail feathers, it's probably a good place to look for a molt limit. Pule also uses a lot of abbreviations, but he does provide these on page 31 and also the back cover of the book as well. And these kind of go through, he abbreviates all the different kinds of molt. He abbreviates, he categorizes molt into 5 different: absent, limited, partial, incomplete, complete. We just kind of talked about partial and complete tonight because we could be here all night if we decided to do all of that. And then he also abbreviates all of the feather tracks as well, and all of that is on the back cover of the book. So this is the bar graph I was kind of talking about. And so this is supposed to give you an idea of when you can age or sex particular birds based on the time of year. And so just looking at this, it looks like a bunch of nonsense. What you need to know is, like, on the left, this is the ages, and then here is the sexes. And so what the symbols mean, black means that over 95% of the time you can age a bird that you've caught. So for example, if you catch a ruby-throated hummingbird in August, there's a 95% chance that you'll be able to reliably age it as a hatch-year bird. Cross-hatched is 25 to 95, dots is 5 to 25, white is 5%. So if we looked further down at the after second year ruby-throated hummingbird, you can see there's a good chance you'll be able to age them as such in January, but it slowly goes down throughout the year, and by May, you won't be able to age them to that degree of specificity anymore. And then he also talks about whether you can sex them. So depending on what symbol you see here, if it's male, female, whether they're alone or together, that means 75% of the time you will be able to reliably sex the bird. If you see the symbol in parentheses, it's 5 to 75%, and if it's just a circle, it's less than 5. So let's just look at northern cardinal, just an example. In April and May, you won't be able to sex them, though you can age them quite reliably. Getting into June and July, you'll be able to sex the males and age them. And then the further you kind of go into the year, the more likely you're able to determine whether it's male or female. And Pule does this for each species. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing my screen now. There. Okay. So I know that was a lot of terminology that was probably thrown at you, but let's kind of open the floor to questions. I'm just looking at the chat right now. Okay. Already, it looks like those questions were answered. Okay, but let's open to the floor to questions. If you want to ask a question, either put it in the chat or raise your hand.
I guess I did have a question.
Okay, what's the question?
Oh, so are there any kind of like expectations, since it is kind of out of the way? Like, are we there for the whole summer, or can we come every once a month or something like that? How does that work if you wanted to volunteer?
Yeah, so there is no expectation that you're going to be there a certain amount of time. If you only have time for a day, that's totally fine. When we do have high volunteer traffic, we say limit your visit to 2 weeks, but that's kind of the only time limitation, I would say.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, it really is a lot to digest. So someone asked, how far in advance would volunteers need to register with you? It depends. I like as much notice as I can, especially when we do have a higher volume of volunteers. But as long as I know you're coming like a couple days in advance, I can usually make that work. So when is the peak of spring migration? The week you catch the biggest number of birds. I would say peak spring would be, it's usually the second or third week of May. It depends on a lot of factors because birds will migrate kind of based on weather, based on like sky conditions. So it kind of varies a little bit from year to year, but yeah, usually like second or third week of May, around there. What was the most amount of birds you've caught in a day? I think the biggest day, like a single day, we caught, I think it was 400 birds around that, in that ballpark. We had 2 banders and 2 scribes growing and 2 people extracting basically constantly. It was insane. And that's only happened like once in the 10 years I've been out there. So I hope it doesn't happen again. So we have the nets up for 6 hours every day. Generally, we run 7 in the morning to 1 p.m. We do change that kind of later in the fall. If like once it starts getting really cold in the mornings, we'll go 8 to 2 instead. Okay, which species of hawk do you capture? So we catch sharp-shinned hawks, Cooper hawks from time to time. We've caught merlins, broad-winged hawks, and there is one record where they caught a red-tailed hawk, but that was very unusual and very lucky. They were just walking up to the net and they saw the hawk hit the net and they were able to pounce on it and get it out really quick. Usually we won't catch red-tailed hawks. They're way too big for our little nets. My favorite species to capture. I really like ovenbirds because they're a little bit bigger than some warblers, and they're very soft in the hand for some reason. I don't know why. They just have a very nice feel in the hand. I also love American tree sparrows because they're just absolutely adorable. So the station will open in May. Our first day of coverage is May 8th, and we go until the 31st. And then we're closed for June and July because it's the breeding season, and we'll open back up on August 2nd, so like the day after the holiday Monday. And so the station operates from 7 a.m. to 1 p.m. If you're just looking to visit, our visitor hours are typically 9 to 1, but we're open for that 6 hours every day, like coverage wise. Okay. So just a little bit about the avian influenza. So the Bird Banding Office is the organization that oversees bird banding in Canada. They did put out a message earlier this year that avian influenza had been detected, and to take down any baiting stations. So anything that would create artificial congregations of birds. And because we're using mist nets and it's a passive form of trapping, we're not attracting them in, we're not artificially mushing them together, like we're not causing like extra numbers of birds to be together. We don't have to really change any of our protocols. We do need to be aware of it, like we're gonna watch for symptoms in any of the birds that we capture this spring for sure. And we will be implementing like extra like sanitation but we were already doing that for COVID. So it doesn't really affect our station so much. I have been getting like a few emails and messages about this. So just kind of on a broad avian influenza. At this point, it's not required that you take down like your songbird feeders, because the majority of birds being affected by the influenza are waterfowl and raptors and commercial poultry operations. So the one thing I would say is make sure that you're sanitizing your feeders weekly, but that's something you should already be doing because there is infections that birds can give to each other via feeders. And if you are like really concerned, if you're seeing symptoms, take down your feeders, especially if you keep poultry. Like if you keep any chickens, I would recommend taking down those feeders. So do you guys have any other questions? I can answer anything really about, so the symptoms. Usually symptoms of like illness in birds, like the big one is typically lethargy, like they're not as active. Like if you approach a bird and it doesn't try to get away from you, that's a really good indicator that it's sick or injured. I think the majority of the symptoms for the avian influenza, something we typically see a whole lot. Yeah, and I just kind of looked it up quickly, make sure I'm not missing anything. A lot of like the symptoms they list online are specifically for something like chickens. Like it talks about a drop in production of eggs. But yeah, a big thing is being quiet and not moving a lot. Avian influenza can be fatal to birds. It cannot spread to humans though. Like there are no cases found in humans. As far as we know, it can't be passed to humans, but still, if you do come across any dead waterfowl, obviously don't go and touch it with your bare hands. You can call the Ministry of Environment. That's where any sightings can be reported, essentially. Okay. But yeah, like I said, like I do say, like we say, like the minimum age is 16, but I have bent the rules before. Like I would say, like I think the youngest that I've allowed to handle birds is 13 or 14. But yeah, I would say as long as they're mature enough and they're able to understand that they're handling a live bird and to kind of understand the significance of that, and as long as we can kind of explain that to them, I think it's usually good, especially if they're a really keen bird enthusiast. I don't want the age limit to deter you. And yes, thank you for putting that information in the chat, Angela. Angela is actually going to be my assistant this year, and she has worked with Salthaven West. So she actually probably knows a little bit more about sick animals than I do.
Hi, Jordan.
Hello.
Hi. Are we able to email you now or anytime, or when should we send you an email to register?
Yeah, you can email me at any time. I actually started getting emails back in January about volunteering. So yeah, you can email me at any time and we can start getting things sorted.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you.
There, and my email is online, but I'll just throw it into the chat. I'm also going to put in the link for the Google Drive. Like I said, like this was like very like information heavy tonight. So I hope like the kind of the supplemental material can kind of help you wrap your head around molt if that's kind of your goal. Sorry, I sent the link and my email is a direct message instead. Sorry about that. That is the link. And that is followed by my email. But yeah, you can email me at any time with any questions you have about like bird banding or volunteering or visiting as well. There's also lots of information on the Nature Sask website if you just go to the Last Mountain Bird Observatory tab. Yes, thank you everyone for coming. Our presentation's kind of coming to an end. Yeah, thank you all for coming and sitting through that. I know it was a ton of information at once, but I hope you kind of, even if you understand molt a little bit better, that was kind of my goal. Lots of these banding workshops are usually like weekends or week-long things. So I had to kind of condense it down and make it as short as possible. When I was making the presentation, at first I was like, oh, how am I going to talk for an hour? And then it became, how can I talk for only an hour? And quickly ballooned into far too much information. Yes, thank you to everyone who came. I'm glad you enjoyed the presentation.